Welcome to the Curriculum Studies Genealogy Podcast. Today we have with us a very special guest, the preeminent historian of the curriculum studies field, Bill Schubert. Very excited to have you here to talk with us about your intellectual roots, your genealogy in the field. Do you want me to start off with a question, or you want to just say something now?
Well, you can go ahead and start off with the question if you want to. I just would say that I think this is a good project, and something that I think is valuable. Not to get me on tape necessarily, but to interview curriculum scholars as you've been doing, so I commend that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. No, I do think it is valuable, and we hope to have many of these conversations that hopefully, people can look back at years from now to sort of.
I wish we had more, interviews with already taped of people in the past. We have some, right, but here and there, but not too much.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. It would be really nice to have that. So we could go back and hear the voices of people from the past, for sure.
So I'm just going to chime in right quick. So my idea for this project came from reading Foucault and his book Archaeology of Knowledge. And the idea that I got from the book was that knowledge is completely arbitrary, and the way that history comes to us could have been otherwise. So the way that we're trying to put this project together is it has nothing to do with chronology or anything. Because, the people that we've been asking really reflect, a very kind of, let's ask this person, that person. It's arbitrarily chosen, and we're getting all different generations and that's kind of the idea. There's no chronology, nothing like that. So that's not really the interest. The interest is whatever comes. So that's the bigger project.
So let's see what comes.
Let's see what comes.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I can ask something that can draw us back to your beginnings, and education and curriculum studies. And what compelled you to go into education at the time that you did?
Well, I'm not exactly sure when I went into education. I think maybe in some sense I've always been in education. I come from a family of educators. My father was a school administrator, a coach, teacher, and so on. My mother was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. My great aunt, my grandmother's twin sister, was a teacher, and another great aunt was a teacher, and several of them, almost all of them, were my teachers in small town northeastern Indiana growing up. So I could talk about that, although as a rebellious teenager, I didn't really want to go into education formally, although I knew a lot about it, but just by being around teachers and school leaders and so forth a lot. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking about education, really thinking about what we call the curriculum questions, like with my friends and so forth, and trying to think about what life is all about and what the meaning of life is, and where where we should turn for insights about that. So I look at that as part of the beginnings of my own interest in that finally resulted in curriculum studies. But if I were going to think about my intellectual roots relative to curriculum studies, I would think about those early years as well as college and grad school and all those kinds of things.
And is that mainly curriculum that existed outside of the school? It seems like not.
Uh,
I mean, how did you relate to the
yeah,
curriculum in the school at that time?
well, I didn't, I mean, curriculum in the school was kind of like home to me because I had so many, as a small town, I had so many relatives who were connected with the schools. And so my first grade teacher was my great aunt Pearl. And my and then we moved to a farm after second grade, and I went to a little one-room country school with outhouses and a pump outside, and so on. My grandmother was the teacher in third and fourth grade. We had a row for each class, and there were 5 kids in my third grade class, and two intruders came, and we had 7 when I was in fourth grade. Uh, but so and then there there was a good teacher who retired, who down the road, who had a fifth through eighth grade school, and I was supposed to go there, but the country kid, but she retired, and they couldn't get a good person to take her place, and so my parents had me go with my father to the school where he was principal and pay tuition. It was public school though, but he didn't want to get in any trouble, like bringing his kid in for free. So fifth, sixth, and seventh grade, I went to Pleasant Lake, which was an even smaller town of 500 people. And and I was from the big town of Butler, Indiana, of almost 2,000 people, for heaven's sakes. So, and
And where does
those towns were were a curriculum for me too, growing up in those towns.
yeah, for sure. What
Mhm.
what what you were talking earlier about trying to figure out what's important and where to find insight into what's important.
Yeah.
Um, what were some of the, that kind of small town life? Where did that, where did those questions
Well,
lead you to? I mean, what
yeah.
kind of
I mean, it
questions were
was.
you having?
I mean, where did I turn? Where did I turn for insights? Well, uh, my family, for one. Also, my family started when I was about 7 years old um, to go on uh, family road trips. Since they had some of the summer off, we would think up a bunch of places to go, and we just drive there, and all over the United States and much of Canada, a little bit of Mexico, and so on. And we were so we went 3 or 4 weeks every summer, and I began to lobby to be the. I was an only child, so my lobbying was often successful, and so I helped plan those. Maybe that was curriculum planning of the journey, the journey metaphor.
That's right.
So and so that's one source. Another source in growing up in Indiana on a farm much of the time. I lived on a farm. Was to just think about aspects of nature and things like that. I was out just wandering around in the fields and the woods and so on, and helping with the farming sometimes. Uh, and sports was big in Indiana too, and so basketball, Hoosiers, all that.
Hmm.
So I played on the teams, and I even developed fictional sports before there was fictional sports as something popular. I had my teams and so on. One time I got a set of Army characters for Christmas or something, and I thought, I don't want to play Army. And I don't know why I didn't want to play Army. A lot of kids did, but I said, well, I'm going to make these into sports heroes. And so I did, and I imagined all that, and I imagined teams, and I've even written about those. I work something about my star player Pat Rolium into my book. Sometimes I squeeze him in there, So,
I didn't know that.
and
Which
people
book
don't.
is that, Bill? Where?
Oh, several of them. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of. In the acknowledgments, I acknowledge Pat Rolium for his
You
info.
do not.
Yes, I do. I do. And how did Pat Rolium come about? Well, one day when I was in 5th grade, we were studying about petroleum. And and every day in the
I didn't
winter,
know you were so funny, Bill.
when I went home from school, I'd run upstairs, and if it was too cold and snowy to go outside and play with the basketball, I would. And my mother didn't let me have the basketball and play with it in the house. So I was in 5th grade, and I would go up and I'd put on some shorts and an undershirt and come down to the living room and pretend like I'd come from the dressing room into a basketball court, and I would shoot a balloon around around the room and run and dribble and whatever. And I would announce the game as I was playing, and I would say, and Smith, pass it the ball over to, and then I said, pass it the ball over to Petroleum, and he jump shoot scores, and so and after I said passes to Petroleum several times, I thought that sounds stupid. Maybe it'd be better to call him Pat Rolium, so yeah.
Oh, the genesis of your imagination.
All right.
So anyway, that
Bill,
was fabulous.
After you had petroleum, how did you get into the reconceptualization? Like, we can move ahead to the Bill Piner bunch and Bergamo and all that stuff. How did that happen?
Well, I heard about these conferences, and the first one I went to was the one in Milwaukee, pre-Bergamo, a conference in Milwaukee, and then I went to Ann and I went out to 2 then later in Airlie House, and then we started going to the ones in Bergamo, and I found it to be a place where I could really unleash that imaginative spirit and share ideas, and it really made me feel good to know that there were other people kind of like me who were not with the same ideas, but were thinking about curriculum in a new way. I'd always thought that if I was really going to think seriously about curriculum, be it with schools or not, it was about it had to be about the emergent identity, or what makes me, or what makes other people them. And as I was working as a teacher with kids, I kept thinking, how can I really purport or propose to teach them if I don't know about the other curriculum that influenced their lives, what I then later began to call the outside curriculum, or the out of school curriculum, and so on. And so, that was an important kind of thing. And I kind of came to that conclusion when I was an undergraduate at Manchester College, which is a liberal arts college in Indiana. And I remember being asked. I didn't have a real strong academic background, because I must tell you this. This is confession here. I didn't read very much as a kid, because I think I had a reading problem, but they didn't have diagnosis of reading problems very much in those days. And when I got to reading, was supposed to read longer things, I could read, but I always read as if I was reading out loud, but not moving my lips and so forth. But I couldn't make my eyes move along the page in a way that I could comprehend. So I mean that was a big problem for me, and I had to figure all kinds of imaginative ways to compensate for that. And so when people come up to me and say, hey, you're a well-read person in the curriculum field, I say, well, you don't know exactly. You know, now they'll know. It's on this podcast, right? It's going to be.
Well, you said confession. We didn't ask you for one.
But I figure might as well get it out there.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So when you read my book, do you imagine characters like what you call them, Paladrone or Petroleum Man or
Petroleum.
Well, you know, I developed a number of different approaches. One was, I remember going to Indiana University right after my bachelor's degree, and I could go into why I went so soon. But I studied in a philosophy of education program where there were a lot of Deweyan pragmatists. And in fact, the head of the philosophy part of that program had studied with Dewey. And
who was that, Bill?
A. Stafford Clayton was his name. He was a brilliant man, and he taught me philosophy of education, introduced me to that. Well, I'd had a course in undergraduate, which I liked, but then in philosophy of education, an elective course, and then I had a course from him, and then he invited me to come into what was called an advanced course, which had mostly doctoral students in it, but I was a master's student. And the sole book for the class was Democracy and Education, and it was to slowly read it, you know, not to, you know, and to really just, you know, go into depth. And I saw at the end of every chapter, there's something called summary. And I thought, oh, good, because of my reading problem, you know, I can just read the summaries. And so after I read a couple summaries, I thought, wait a minute, these aren't summaries. This is extra stuff you want to say. That's what it is, you know. So I still don't know. So I thought, well, I'll just go through it until I get to a meaningful passage, and then I will try to assume that everything else is connected with the central idea of that meaningful passage. And so on page 76, I got to his definition of education, which is that reorganization and reconstruction of experience that adds to the meaning of experience and helps to create a direction for subsequent experience. Just roughly quoted, and then I would go to other places in the book and I'd read something at random and I'd say, aha, it connects with that definition, you know, and so that's kind of the way that I made my way through that book.
So who did you study with for your doctorate?
J. Harlan Shores at the University of Illinois. Miss Stanley and Shores did a curriculum book that was very well known in the 50s. And I studied there in the 70s with Shores. I think I was his last doctoral student.
What was your dissertation?
It was called Imaginative Projection, a Method of Curriculum Invention. So kind of fits with the Petroleum and with the reading of Dewey and so on. And I tried to explore that. I asked myself, I didn't have too much time to do a doctorate. I had a family and so on, and I got a sabbatical leave from my school district that I was teaching at in the suburb of Chicago, Downers Grove suburb. And I had a summer, an academic year, and another summer to try to do almost all the coursework that I could, and so I took heavy overloads and so on, and I even took independent studies and audited other courses that I fed into the independent studies, so forth. I and studied all the time, and what was really nice about it though was I was trying, as a teacher, I was trying to study based on my master's experience. I wanted to continue the study that I had worked on. So sometimes I took courses at universities in the Chicago area or nearby, University of Chicago and Northwestern and University of Wisconsin-Madison and so forth. And other times I just tried to study on my own, get books from the library or meet with people I thought were interesting and so on. So I tried to, and then when I got to Urbana-Champaign and met Shores, he said, now I assume you came here because we have a history of people who've written quite a bit in the curriculum field. And I said, yes. He said, well, I've got something to tell you. He said, we don't have a program in curriculum. And I said, he said, so you have to sign up for elementary education or secondary education or whatever, and then you can study curriculum. But you and I can just work out what it means to study curriculum. And I thought that was fantastic. I thought that was better than having a programmed kind of course. And so I got a carrel in the library in the stacks, in the middle of the stacks. I looked out over the university and went up there and wandered the stacks, brought books back, and just read and read and read my own way of reading. Imagined what must be in these books. So I always thought it was kind of funny. I'd write about books and people would quote me and I would think, wow, so they think I know what was in the book. Well, I kind of did, but not in the same way most people did. Maybe that's good. I don't know.
So when you went to these other places to take courses, I'm particularly interested in University of Chicago. Do you remember what you took there, who you studied with?
Oh yeah, I studied. I took. That was when Philip Jackson and Joseph Schwab and Ralph Tyler. Well, Ralph Tyler had left by that time. Benjamin Bloom. But Erickson, there's a fellow named Don Erickson, not Fred Erickson, but Don Erickson. He taught a course on the free school movement, which was big at the time. This was probably about 1972 or something like that, I think it was. And I didn't have, if I couldn't get an assistantship there or something, I couldn't have afforded it. So I could afford one course in the summer, which I did, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't think of going there. The other one was Madison, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They had a big research project, which was for schools that were moving into the open education or open space education, kind of a progressive instantiation of education that a lot of schools were moving to in those days, because the architects kind of sold schools on the idea of open space meant open communication. Stupid idea, but they sold them on it. And some of the professors at Wisconsin, this was before Mike Apple. This is 1969. Apple came there in 71. I think, somebody named Ken Howey was there. He was rather well known. I went to Ohio State later on. And anyway, so I was part of that program, which was to help educate people to be in those either places, newly built places, newly built open schools, or ones where walls were knocked out and things like that. So I worked with interns, and I worked with people preparing to be teachers in those in schools in the summer, and then those interns and came to our school. We had one of those open schools, which was a kind of model school in the Chicago area, and it was funny. It's kind of a funny story. I'll make it real brief. But so we were inventing what to do in this school. The teachers there, and the people from Wisconsin who were trying to facilitate us were also trying to learn from what we did, I guess, too. I don't know. I didn't quite understand the whole connection of the thing, but I worked with interns who were, like they had differentiated staffing and teams of teachers and things like that. And I remember we kept the guests away, visitors, for the first semester, and then they came in droves. So it was nothing to have like 10, 20 people coming to watch what we did so they could go back to their school and get the status of having a school that was like that.
When I was in sixth grade, Bill, now I'm 61. I was born in 1962. I don't know what year that would be because I can't do math. But we had an open classroom.
Yeah, so that would have been about you were in sixth grade, you were 11. So if you 1973 or something, right?
Yeah.
So that was around the same time.
Right.
The same time. But what really struck me one time was so somebody stayed after to talk with me about their visiting, and this guy, he had a check sheet of some kind, and he was looking at it and looking at us, and he said, I can't believe it. How did you do it? I said, how did we do what? And he said, how did you comply with every single dimension of Wisconsin design? And I said, what's Wisconsin design? And turns out, the best I could come up with was that they wrote about what we did and made it into something that they advocated that other schools had to, be members of and comply with. But I didn't know that they were. I knew that they had the project going and everything, but I didn't know. So I just thought, well, there's an insight in educational change, Bill Pinar calls school deform.
Right, school deform, right. School deform, right. Well, that's interesting. You've had a lot of experiences where you weren't under the, all the jumping, the grids and the rubrics and the jumping through hoops and
Yes.
Wow.
But yeah, we still had some of that, but we didn't have, the testing, we had Iowa tests at the end of the year or something like that. And it was good if you.
But there were stakes attached to those.
But what? Yeah, right. So it was a different time, and there were problems. There were behavioral objectives that you had to you were supposed to try to write, and I always tried to get out of writing them, and I always tried not to do lesson plans. And I thought one of the thoughts I had was I wanted to go into curriculum to stop all the planning and advocate for improvisation, because the best stuff that I ever did was sometime I was pushed into a corner. I mean, I could tell stories about that too, being pushed into a corner as a teacher, and I invented something that I had no idea I was going to invent. And it turned out to be good, and I kept doing it then later. So, yeah. That was like my guest speakers, my guest speaker routine
Right.
where I do, I role play as the intellectual traditionalist, the social behaviorist, the experientialist, the critical reconstructionist.
I know where that comes from now.
No,
Right.
it kind of
Petroleum
came from,
or whatever his name was.
It probably came partly from Pat Rolliam, but it came, yeah, but it came, it came from elementary school, actually, although I didn't role play as a experientialist or somebody for the fifth and sixth
I'm sure
graders.
you did. You're a genius.
Well, what I did though,
playing as an existentialist.
What I did though, I was supposed to, I was telling the kids that I was going to tell them all about prehistoric times, and I was going to raise great questions. Who are we? Where are we? When are we? Why are we? And we're going to talk about those things philosophically and everything. And then the principal came by and said, we're going to have an assembly in 20 minutes. And I thought, well, I can't get into all that in just 20 minutes. So I said to the kids, I said, okay. And I don't know why I said this. I think I watched the Tonight Show the night before, and I saw Rich Little doing a routine on imitating people, or something. And I said, instead of doing this, we'll do this tomorrow, but today I'm going to be a prehistoric man. And I thought, oh my God, I just said that.
Right.
And I had like 60 some kids, 2 sections of 6th grade, and I had to live up to it, and I said, plus adults, visitors or whatever, that were there too. And and so I had to be a prehistoric man. So I kind of did the Rich Little thing. I turned around, and said, I just jumped out at him. I didn't know what to do. And I said, and a prehistoric man might do that. And I'll tell you how I prefaced it was, I looked up at the board and I told him about what different social scientists do in a previous unit, but it still happened to be up on the board. So archaeologist, geographer, historian, so forth, all up there. And so when I went, some kid, I said, I'm going to do something as the prehistoric man. You have to tell me which social scientists might study that. And so when I went, some kid says linguist, and it wasn't even up there. I couldn't,
right.
So, and that really worked well. And then some kid liked the idea of being prehistoric man so much, the biggest discipline problem in the class. He jumped up and he ran up to the front and he started to push me away. And he said, you be in the audience and I'll be the prehistoric man. And some kid yells, political scientist, because it's a change of leadership.
Regime change.
So
Plato.
we did all that kind of stuff. And so when I went to doctoral studies, I said to myself, what should I write a dissertation about? Maybe I should get that in mind right away so that I can tailor every class content or whatever to what I want to do, because I have a limited amount of time. So I said, so I thought, and I thought, what did I learn as a teacher for 6 years? And I said, I learned the importance of the philosophical imagination or the literary imagination for teaching. And so I'm going to study that. That's what I'm going to do. So that's what I did. Imaginary projection, a method of.
Wow, what a story.
Yeah, really.
That's a great story. So when we ask our students about dissertations, you have to come and tell them that, because I mean, I never heard anything like that.
You just play it.
Yeah,
Watch
right.
this.
So, yeah, so.
So let me ask you this. This is maybe a little a step back before we move into your career. But here you are, like growing up in Indiana, playing sports, surrounded by family. It seems like a very comfortable childhood. And yet
Yeah.
there's also this idea that incredulity is the, foundation of philosophy. And so, like, what made you incredulous? Like, it seemed like life was pretty good for you. Um, so, like,
Uh,
what was the spark that brought you into seeing that, oh, justice is an issue? Was it just the times, being around the 60s and 70s, or was there something?
Eventually, it was. When I was a kid, though, uh, the incredulous nature kind of popped up uh, real early. Like I was I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but all of a sudden you triggered this. I'd been to Sunday school, and I asked my parents. I said, "So we've studied about prehistoric, back to the prehistoric time. We've studied about prehistoric people, and now they talk about Adam and Eve in Sunday school. Who came first, Adam and Eve, or the cavemen?" And so
Good question.
I was only about six,
Yeah.
and and my parents got a little flustered by it because they didn't know exactly what to tell me. I think they must have been flustered, but they said, "Well, your grandpa Schubert, who was a Lutheran minister in my dad's father in Cleveland, uh, came every maybe twice a year or something to visit us, and they said." Why don't you ask your grandpa Schubert? He would be an expert on that. And and I think they maybe thought that I would just forget,
Right.
but no, I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And 6 months later, my grandpa Schubert drives in for his summer visit. And I run out to the car, and he usually had candy or something and wanted to offer me the candy. I didn't want the candy. I just said, Grandpa, who came first? Adam and Eve or the caveman? and and he looks at me and he says, "Well, some people think Adam and Eve, and some people think the caveman." And I thought, what? What?
There's no
The
answer.
expert has to say? I mean, the expert doesn't know. And I think I was ready for Dewey's The Quest for Certainty book. So, where he debunks the quest for certainty.
Right.
So,
That's funny.
yeah. So, I mean, that was one of the places. And another thing you ask about how, in that, it, it wasn't as a placid kind of environment as it might seem. Uh, it, I, um, uh, I mean, there were, if I wanted to interact with the top 10 students in my class, which I did because I thought they were, smart and fun to interact with. So we had this little group of 3 boys and 5 girls who hung out together and did stuff. Occasionally we dated each other, and other times we you know, just palled around or whatever. But almost all of them were from fundamentalist church backgrounds. I wasn't. I was from the Methodist Church, which in that community was more like a social,
Commune.
like a club, social, like the country club church or the business community, where the professionals went to that church. And so, but when I got to know, I mean, it caused a kind of a rift for me when I met the fundamentalist kids, because I thought they had a deeper interest in their religion. I mean, their religion connected with their life more than um, kind of more than mine did.
Right.
And so, in order to get along with them, I had to, like try to learn the fundamentalist ways and be kind of part of that environment for a while, which I was.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that was
That's
that was
interesting.
kind of that was kind of strange.
Yeah.
And I tried to live it. here's a here's a kind of, it just brings to mind a kind of a funny story on our the we didn't have a prom or whatever, probably because of fundamentalists not wanting to dance or something, I don't know. But we did have a senior trip where he saved up money and earned money to go to Washington and New York. And so here were all these kids. I'd traveled quite a bit because of those summer trips and so on that I told you about. But we were, 17 years old, and in New York City, wandering around, and some of the kids did crazy things in the hotel, like they would think it was fun to throw light bulbs or glasses out the window and see them smash on the street and surprise people. They could have killed people, but and so the bouncers and guards and people from the hotel came up to the rooms and started going in and raiding us and telling us, and my friend and I were reading our Bible, and and they came in and said, "What's going on in here?" And I turned around and I was just honest. I said, "Well, we're reading the Bible." They said, "Yeah, sure."
Really funny.
But so there were a lot. I mean, I think there were quite a few um, things, and also, the occupations and things were limited. So um, I didn't. I would have had an opportunity to be a farmer, but I didn't really know that much about farming, nor did I necessarily want to learn it. But I didn't know what I wanted to be. Um, I was a teacher. Get this: when I was 17, I was a teacher because in a small town like that, you don't have a substitute pool. And my mom was a teacher in the high school, and she devised an opportunity for kids who thought they might want to be teachers to hook up with an elementary school teacher and do a cadet teaching kind of experience. And I did that with a man who I'm still friends with. He's 88 now, and and we're still in touch. And he inspired me quite a lot. But the teacher next to him had to go to the hospital for 3 weeks, and I was apprenticing for him one period a day. They didn't know where to get a substitute for her, and so the high school principal and the elementary principal decided to ask me if I would be the sub. I don't know if it was legal or what.
Illegal.
They said we would. They said we'll take you out of your senior classes, your physics class, your government class, your English class, whatever, and we'll just teachers won't punish you for being gone or whatever, and so and you can teach this. I guess it was a 6th grade class, and Mr. Hampel, who was supervising me already in his classroom, will just kind of poke his head in once in a while, see if things are going okay. And so for 3 weeks, I taught 6th grade, and it was a really good experience because nobody's telling me what to do or whatever. I was just kind of figuring it out, and in a sense, it was better than student teaching, which I had at the end of my college, because even though I was a liberal arts major, I decided I better get credentialed. And so I did for elementary school teaching from college, but I'd already had that experience, which was fantastic. So
Yeah, that's really interesting.
anyway,
One of
maybe.
those opportunities that come up in a small town, probably
Yeah,
not
yeah,
other kinds of situations. All right, well, let's if everyone's okay, we can jump into like post, early career. Who were some
sure.
of the people that
Early
you worked
early
with
career at university, right?
or
You
late
mean
career at university?
you
What's
don't
that?
mean early career, not teaching career, but
Yeah,
not
like at the
elementary teaching, but yeah,
postdoctorate.
yeah.
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 Um, like
Yeah.
who were some of the people that you were reading? Who were some of the people you were working with?
Okay.
What were some of the ideas that were
Yeah.
influencing you early on?
Uh, well, I worked, at Urbana-Champaign, and finished the work there and went back to Downers Grove because I had to give them one more year of teaching at least.
Mm.
I mean, I think they hoped that after a sabbatical that I would stay there, and they wanted to make me a um, whatever you call it, a kind of a chair of a middle school,
Hmm.
uh, something or other. But in the meantime, I was interviewing with places and universities because I was finishing my dissertation, and so I actually did the dissertation, finished it in '75. I had started the coursework in '73, so that was kind of fast.
Yeah.
That's
Uh,
very fast.
Yeah.
yeah, and so while I taught, I finished writing, or I did most of the writing of the dissertation while I taught that year. I was influenced by Shores, of course, by Harry Brody, a philosopher of education at Urbana-Champaign, um, by Lou Rubin. I don't know if you know any of these people or not. He was a good curriculum scholar, and there was an administrator there who had been the state superintendent of New Jersey, uh, Frederick Raubinger, and he knew a lot about political intrigue in the uh, in the policymaking realm and so on. So I thought that was interesting, but Spodek was another person I studied with in early childhood education. Uh, when my advisor, Harlan Shores, retired, they had Jim McDonald come in and give a special lecture. And
Eli,
uh, well, I didn't get to know him much then, but early in my career, in the summer of '81, Ann and I were invited to go to University of Victoria, out off Vancouver there, uh, and teach for a summer. And Max Van Manen and Judith Van Manen were out there at the time,
Mm.
and it was fun to get to know them. And it was very interesting in the course that I was teaching. I kept referring to the people in the curriculum field, who are associated with reconceptualization, and Maxine Green, Dwayne Hubner, Jim McDonald, and I went on and on about some of them. And then afterward, a bright student came up and said, "Well, that's really interesting. We had a professor last summer whose name is Jim McDonald." Uh, and I said, "Yeah, that is James B. McDonald. That's who it is. You had James B. McDonald last summer." And he couldn't believe it because he said that McDonald always um, uh, passed out his published work in mimeograph. And because I guess he just didn't want to intimidate the students. And I thought that was pretty amazing, that he would do that anyway. Uh, so, and then, I developed connections through some of that work, like Ted Aoki invited me to come up and serve on dissertation committee that he chaired. And so going to the Bergamo conference was so different than any other conferences, except for one. Within AERA, there was this group that I went to called the SIG, the Special Interest Group on Creation and Utilization of Curriculum Knowledge. It sounds really a hardware store kind of. but that's morphed into the curriculum SIG on curriculum and curriculum theory and cultural studies or something like that. Right now, it's the same group, and that group was started by Edmund Short and Paul Clore, and Paul Clore, was the mentor of Bill Pinar and Janet Miller and Paul Shaker and Craig Crydell and a whole group of Norm Overly and a whole group of people that had a big influence on reconstruction. And
Edmund Short taught at Georgia Southern.
Yeah.
For a while. Yeah,
he was at Penn State a lot of his career, and then when he retired, he came to Georgia Southern, and then he's down in Florida now, and and he has one of the like I do. They have an archive of his stuff too at the library. So those were great conferences, and what happened in those conferences was you didn't get a trinket or some kind of a kit or something like you might get at an ASCD conference to take back to your school district and plug in and bring change, but you would get ideas, and they become part of you, and they grow within you. I mean, that's how I developed this notion that I wrote about in the Peters Encyclopedia that you brought several of us to, Marla, what I call the theory within, the theory that grows within you, that becomes part of you. It's not like theory, when a lot of times when students in dissertations, say, oh, what's your theoretical framework? And they have to fashion something that is just totally outside themselves. And, it's so wrong. I mean, it's like to think of it that way, but how do you get students to think? I mean, it's a big question. How do you get students to think about the theory, the constructs, the beliefs, the ideas that guide their lives? And that's part of what I was writing about in my dissertation as well, too.
But, yeah, I mean, it's
and trying to apply.
It's supremely complex. I mean, obviously, most people grow up thinking that they see the world objectively or normally without considering the ideas that are influencing their lenses. So, and how do you show that to them?
Yeah.
And get them to talk about it. So those were kind of the things that you were writing about early in your career.
Yeah, I did quite a bit of writing, but not publishing really, but writing. Something that I've gone back to in my retirement, but during my teaching career.
And what were you writing about then, sort of?
I was writing about some of this stuff, but I was, in a way, since I didn't have to appeal to any, I wasn't really trying to get it published, although I'm sure I would have been thrilled to get it published, but I didn't send it off very often. I pretended like I was intergalactic educational anthropologist who was looking at Earth and commenting on, all the goofy things that were going on. I really think that, I kind of, while I was a teacher, I had a kind of freedom that I didn't have as even as a professor, even as a tenured or full professor, so,
Because of the
it's kind of,
expectations.
yeah, kind of the expectations and so forth. So, but I feel like I most of the time could write what I wanted to write, and
Right.
felt really good about that. I mean, that's certainly something that appealed to me ever since my master's work at Indiana University. I was watching people who were professors, and I was saying, boy, that is a pretty darn good kind of job to have compared with lots of other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I really had it in my mind when I became a teacher. But when I finished the master's program at Indiana, Philip G. Smith, the department chair of Hull, Fish and Smith, that Smith, uh, reflect, uh, reflective inquiry kind of stuff about building on Dewey and so on. Anyway, Smith said, we have this new NDEA, National Defense Education Act, grant for doctoral students, and would you like to stay and be a doctoral student here? And I said, well, I'm going to be, maybe not. Maybe I would want to teach a school before I started teaching people about schools or education. But then I thought, I was really torn a lot of the time about whether teaching um, about curriculum was really so much teaching about schools, or is it teaching about how people learn and grow and develop and uh, and think about their identity and are influenced by countless things in addition to school as well as school. But I knew that there wouldn't be a place in universities for studying education or curriculum if it weren't for schools, because it wouldn't be funded.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
I thought, boy, I mean, this is the truly interdisciplinary area. When I was an undergraduate, I every time I took a class that I liked, I thought I want to major in that.
Mhm.
I want to be a psychologist. I want to be a philosopher. I want to be a theologian. I want to be a literary critic or something, an author,
Right.
novelist or something. But then after I started thinking more and more about education, I thought, well, in order to understand education, you really have to have some degree of insight and expertise from all these different areas.
Hmm.
At least that's what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's accurate, and that's why we have such an interdisciplinary field.
Mhm.
What were some of the pieces that you wrote over your career that I don't know what to say, that they represent some of your evolutions throughout time, or that you're proudest of, or I don't know, just like what are some of the things that you point to and say, oh, well, this is a nice legacy to leave?
Well, one of the first things that I thought about was the literature of the field, and so that was when Ann and I did curriculum books the first 80 years in 1980, was I think that was an important contribution because there hadn't been a centralization of the literature of the field. I mean, we did it in one way. It could be done in lots of different ways. And then we also, that led to thinking about genealogy stuff, which was a publication that appeared twice, 2 iterations of it in JCT. Trying to look at who studied with whom and how far back you can trace those trees and so on. We eventually got to the point where we thought that it was so important to realize that it's not just your advisor, though, it's who influenced you throughout your career too. It's that it is your advisor. That advisor plays a big role, but other people you studied with or colleagues that you've had along the way, or people at other universities that you associate with or co-author things with, or whatever, So, really to develop full genealogies, you'd have to and try to include all the different kinds of influences. And so when I think of something like, I remember Bill Ayers and Bill Watkins and I used to talk with students about, literature review. And we kind of try to phrase it like this. It's not just a thumbnail sketch of a bunch of, like doing a little search on everything connected with the words in this topic or your title. It's more like, what have you read? How has everything that you've read contributed, not only read, but heard about or whatever experience, but, how has all that contributed to the way you think about this topic or problem now? And, that might include, fictional works, poetry, movies that you've seen, as well as philosophical and historical and sociological and works in education and so on. So the genealogy stuff is another thing that I'm kind of proud about, but I have a lot of reservations about it too, because how can it be complete? It's almost like you'd have to have a biography of each of the persons, in order to really understand the genealogy. But it is something to know, for instance, that that Marla studied with, say, Bill Pinar, and that Bill Pinar studied with Paul Clore, and so did a bunch of other people, and they interacted, and Paul Clore studied with Harold Alberti, and Harold Alberti studied with Boyd Boda, and Boyd Boda studied philosophy at Cornell, and might have run into Charles DeGarmo there. We don't know for sure. So it kind of breaks off at that point. And then Daniel, you studied with, I think you studied with Shapiro maybe, or
Leila Villaverde.
Pardon.
I was with Leila Villaverde, who studied with Joe Kinchelow, who.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, and you can trace, that back too. Mm-hmm. And that tells you something. It does tell you something. I studied with Harlan Shores. Harlan Shores studied with some people at University of Minnesota, including Miller, of the Miller analogies, which was long time required, a test to get into doctoral studies, just like the GRE. I always thought it would be funny to think about how he would ask questions in a dissertation hearing, like analogy questions.
Your dissertation
is yeah.
What?
Yeah. And so anyway, and ultimately that traces back. They trace back to not only Thorndike, but Thorndike crosses over and traces back to William James, which I like better than
really William James and Thorndike.
Yeah,
seem at
James
all
and
alike.
Thorndike published stuff together.
Did they?
Yeah, they studied.
No, I didn't know
They
that.
they studied things like.
They're so different. I mean,
I know, I
God.
know. And Thorndike studied with James McKean Cattell, who studied with Wilhelm Wundt at the
Oh
who
my.
developed the first psychological
Yeah.
laboratory in Europe.
Right.
But Thorndike had studied with some with James at Harvard, and so there's just interesting combinations of people and who they studied with, how they did stuff. But the thing that they worked on together, Thorndike and James, was the question of, well, why do we have to have Greek and Latin so much? Does that really train the mind, or does geometry really train the mind? And they did tests, they did empirical tests to study if you study nonsense syllables versus if you study Greek and Latin or geometry or things that are allegedly supposed to train your mind, is it any better? And they found out no. and so that really actually led to the cutting off of some of those requirements for Greek and Latin and things. But I think they weren't necessarily studying the right thing. I mean, Greek and Latin might have been helpful in some other deeper ways, than just.
Yeah, I mean, it was the faculty psychology was always a bit suspect as a
train the muscles of the mind.
Yeah. So.
Well, I think this whole genealogy thing is really interesting because when you're young, when I was young, I could care less who studied with who studied with who studied. But now that I'm getting older and I kind of try to trace my history way back to my undergraduate career, I'm like, I had no idea why I write like I do or read like I do or think like I do until I started to unearth, oh, I didn't know that person studied, that person studied. Oh my God, no wonder. I mean, it helps you to discover who you are and why you read the way you do or write the way you do. And I think it's a fascinating question because you're right. It isn't just about you. It's like the rhizome. It's like the everything that you've been influenced by.
Yeah,
especially your teachers.
And that's why the idea of the out of school or outside curriculum was so important to me. I mean, it's kind of like, when cultural studies came along or when public pedagogy came along, I thought, that's what I try and emphasize, and that's a darn good way to deal with it, in those bodies of literature. But I was concerned about that from very early times, and I sketched out some of those things at the end of curriculum books the first 80 years, and also curriculum books the first 100 years, and so on. So those were time. And then I also was very much intrigued by when I met curriculum scholars, how many of them were influenced by I guess what was that? I'm just trying to think how to say it. They were all influenced by the arts and literature and so forth, and they didn't write about it much. And I always thought it was kind of funny, ironic that so-called literature reviews hardly ever in education hardly ever have any literature in them. There's not one literary work in this literature review. What is it? Well, I know
that's funny.
George Willis and I spent quite a bit of time asking people to talk about their in the field, talk about the literature that and works of art and music and so on that had influence on their lives. And so that's when we did the book called Reflections from the Heart of Educational Inquiry, Understanding Curriculum and Teaching Through the Arts. And then we also, another thing that I have emphasized, well, and I think all the way back to, think about my childhood too. Instead of books, I mean, there were books that were read to me, like my grandmother read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and Oliver Twist, I remember, to me. And then we would pretend those things after that, and I was like 6 or 7 or something, we would be Becky Thatcher and Tom Sawyer going to the moon and finding moon people. It was weird, so we would do all kinds of great stuff, though. I mean, it was fun. So we would do that. And then I'm thinking about, what did influence me more than the books, really, as a kid growing up, were radio programs and TV programs and movies at the movie theater. I think those had a big influence on me. And I've thought about, just identifying some of the movies or some of the TV shows and saying, what did I get out of those? How they contribute to the way I saw the world. Ideas.
And you were doing cultural studies way before there was cultural studies.
Yeah.
Like caveman.
I guess so, yeah.
For a caveman doing cultural studies.
Pat Rolliam.
That's the funniest thing I ever heard.
Pat Rolliam was a great basketball player. You see,
never missed.
Hardly ever. But anyway. So on one of our trips, well, I made up a basketball place in the whole basketball scene that I made up was in Connecticut. I don't know why I chose Connecticut, and then Pat Rolliam was from Bakersville, Connecticut. Bakersville is this tiny, tiny little place on the map.
Picked it off a map.
I picked it off the map. And then we went on one of our family trips and we were close to Bakersville. And I insisted we had to go to Bakersville. My grandparents couldn't understand, why we're going to this little place, And
you didn't explain Pat Rolliam?
I had to have my picture taken in front of the school in Bakersville, in front of the gym there.
Wow.
That's where Pat Rolliam was from. So then, when I was like 50-something, I was when I was 50-something, I was giving a lecture in Springfield, Massachusetts, and that's very close to Connecticut. I'd gone over to Bakersville again with some friends, and just to see what it was like. I thought I was nuts when I went to the little general store and wanted a souvenir from Bakersville that said Bakersville on it. I couldn't find one very readily.
Bill, I have the perfect title for a chapter: Curriculum as Pat Rolliam Text.
Yeah.
It'll be the next installment of Understanding Curriculum.
Okay, so, but I got to tell you this, and I'm a little nervous about telling you this.
You don't have to.
Oh, well, I want to. I think
it's a safe space.
I don't want. Yeah. So I was near the Basketball Hall of Fame, where in Springfield, Massachusetts, and so I wrote up this little thing about Pat Rolliam, and I took it over to the Basketball Hall of Fame and installed it. there.
That's so
Sneaked it
funny.
in. So
Wow.
he's now in the Basketball Hall of Fame.
Did you take a picture
Realize
of this?
No, before cameras. Before cameras had been invented. No.
Wow, he was really alive. He's been really alive for you.
But he was always like 18.
Right.
And an athlete.
Oh, that's
no
kind of
personality
scary.
besides.
He didn't get older.
Always a
Like I've
nice
seen
guy,
movies
but no.
like that.
Well,
He
yeah.
never got
Well,
older.
I mean, the Bakersville All-Stars would play the Boston Celtics now and then.
Right,
They'd
now
invite
we
him
get,
over and they would play him, but nobody knew about it because they didn't want to embarrass the Boston.
right. That makes a lot of sense, yeah. Pat Rolium dunking on Larry Bird. It would be bad. So were there other texts that you wanted to sort of think about?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, let's see. Oh, another contribution, I guess, that I feel good about having made along the way was reference books. I mean, like the Oxford Encyclopedia of Curriculum Studies, which just came out in 2022, and before that, the Sage Guide to Curriculum, which have articles in, and they did a lot of contributions to the Encyclopedia of Curriculum Studies that Craig Kreidel edited. I was like a secondary editor of some title, and I wrote like 20 some articles for it, but they were shorter articles than the big one for the other two that I mentioned, and the book that Michael Connolly and Ming Fong and Joanne Fillion did, the Sage Handbook, Curriculum and Instruction. I was the curriculum theory editor for that one.
Yeah, those are very important.
So I think that those kind of keep alive the field, sort of like I tried to say in that real long article I wrote in Curriculum Inquiry. It was about 90 pages. I think it was the longest article I ever wrote. It was like their anniversary issue, their, I think, 40th anniversary of Curriculum Inquiry, and they asked me to write about the curriculum books from the beginning of that publication, which was 1968. And interestingly, that was like the span of my teaching career, pretty much. I started as an elementary school teacher in 1967, and then university in 75, and then retired in 2011 or 2011, I guess. So I talked about the field's expansion and the need to do synopses of it at the same time, which was kind of a contradictory sort of thing. I mean, it was expanding, but you still had to kind of make it, express it in certain ways that somebody who's coming into the field could understand it without making it simplistic. Right. And that's, of course, that's something that you grappled with, Marla, with your guides.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. I mean, to keep that spirit of expansiveness alive, and at the same time say what it is, at least for the moment.
Right, you're chasing a moving target, and the minute you got it, you're out of date.
Yeah.
And then who do you choose to put where, and I mean, it was very, very difficult. So I have a lot of respect for all of those attempts at archiving the field, because it's really important to know the history, you know.
Yeah. The other kind of thing that I think about as a contribution is the teacher lore and student lore, which I think, get back at, they're a way of first recognizing that the authorities are not the only people that, that need to think about curriculum and to think about the basic curriculum questions and so on. Of course, that's another contribution. I mean, not that I invented the what's worthwhile question. I mean, that's been around since the beginning of human beings and philosophy and communities and so on, that would ask what's worth knowing and experiencing, doing, being, becoming, overcoming, and wondering about and things like that. But same kind of thing, though. It's just it's something that I think we need to keep alive, and to keep alive, to realize that good teachers think about those kinds of things all the time. So do parents, so do students. And one of the reasons I think that the students are not, not too interested or lose interest in schooling is they don't see it as part of their education.
Right.
They don't see it as the stuff that creates meaning in their lives, or they don't see themselves as creators of meaning, and that being education. And it's partly because schools don't see it or don't want. I mean, look at it, taking out all the books that make you think, from the curriculum, throwing them away. But I living around teachers, my parents and so on. I mean, they had a lot of good insights about teaching and so on. I remember my father only lived part way into when I did my doctoral studies. I was 29 when he passed away. I remember asking him he visited me down in Urbana-Champaign. And I said, well, Dad, you taught, were school administrator, coach, and so on for 30 some years. How what do you think, if I'm going to teach teachers, what do you think I should teach them about? And he paused for a little while, and he said, well, I think two things. And I kind of expect, I mean, he was sort of a tough administrator and coach and so forth. And I kind of expected something a little on the strict side or something coming out of, his suggestion. But he said, I don't know how you teach this, but he said, they need to learn to speak the language of the students. And he didn't mean necessarily that if they speak Spanish, learn Spanish. He might have meant that too, but he meant to speak with the sources of meaning in their lives and so on. And then he said, and learn to feel the hurt within the student. I thought that stuck with me.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things I'm trying to think if there's.
Well, let me make one more transition, unless you have.
So I guess what I was saying is that that's kind of what impelled me to start the teacher lore project.
Yeah.
Get teachers to express what they've learned and figure out ways to do that. And a lot of dissertations have grown out of the teacher lore project, presentations, and so on.
Some very important texts too out of that. So, I mean, just kind of thinking about the last sort of bits that we can discuss here. And I'm thinking about transitioning from your story to sort of an overview of the field and evolutions that you've seen over your career and into the future, where you hope. I don't know, like what kinds of not just evolutions have you had, but what evolutions and changes have you seen in the field?
Well, I do think that the curriculum, I kind of came at the tail end of the curriculum, what might today be called the curriculum development era.
Mhm.
I don't, having known a lot of the people who were engaged in what is often called the curriculum development era, I think it had more to it than is often given credit. That the people, some of the people involved, even Franklin Bobbitt and Ralph Tyler and some of, and Alice Mile and Caswell and L. Thomas Hopkins and Florence Stratmeyer and Harold Alberti and so many of them had lots of, I think, insightful ideas for their times, but for any time in some ways. But I do think that curriculum has moved through reconceptualization and critical studies and practical inquiry and all the different transformations that have occurred, phenomenological inquiry and so on, has moved to a much more, I don't know whether the term intellectual ought to be used for it or not, but maybe so. It's, I mean, to look at it as more of a liberal arts and sciences kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary form of inquiry, which I think, all of those curriculum development people who followed Dewey and James and so forth were actually moving toward or trying to move toward too in their own ways. I mean, even somebody like Franklin Bobbitt, who is classified as a social efficiency kind of person by most people, had a big gap in his career from the beginning of the 1930s to 1941, when he did a book called Curriculum for Modern Education that hardly anybody knows about. It's a big book, about 500 pages, and has no citations, just his own ideas.
Wow.
And on page 298, he says that, now get it, he's the author of How to Make a Curriculum, 1924, that book.
Right.
Think of that title. In 1941, he said, anyone who would try to make a curriculum should be categorized with the dodo and the great auk. That is what he says.
Yeah.
Look.
298.
Yeah, page 298.
Yeah.
So anyway, and then he goes on to say that what we need is a curriculum for every individual. We need to understand every individual differently because they are different. That's kind of, anyway. So
Well, that's coming from a very different place than we typically think of as Bobbitt coming from.
I'm not saying he's a reconceptualist, but I'm saying that there was something going on in the minds of these people in the way that they, Alice Mile wrote a book critiquing in early 1950s, I think it was, critiquing the suburbs saying that they were sterile places where nothing, where diversity would be crushed and so on. There's lots of stuff out there, and I would love to talk more about some of that. But I do think that we, to go back and take more of a look at some of the historical things that we have, and not just think that it's bad because of some of the things that have been said about it, or like Ralph Tyler's stuff, when he, like, he didn't make it into a recipe. He had 4 topics, and at the end of the book, Basic Principles, he says that it's not a recipe. It's just 4 things that you should think about, among other things. But a lot of people made it into a recipe, and that's worthy of great criticism, I think.
Yeah, agree.
Anyway, so I got, like, it's kind of interesting. Sometimes I think back to the people in the curriculum field who are no longer around, like Hopkins and Mile and, Smith, Stanley, and Shores, and a lot of them who I knew. And, I wish I had the time and insight and ability to share more of the things. I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to write about some of those kinds of things too.
Well, we should
but I feel like I've seen some really, I've lived through some good times of curriculum studies, some very thoughtful, kind of critical intersectionality kind of stuff that's gone on in recent years. I think there's a lot that needs to be continue to be explored, but I think the field's still moving in good directions. The problem is, I think that it's not well known. It's not well known what the field is about. It's not even known that there is a field in a way. Like people in the field, not in the field, but I mean the people who are, people in schools, people in policy making areas, and so on, don't even know that this kind of work that's been going on for decades exists.
Why do you think that is?
A similar question, but do you think that people, Alice Mile and Shore, and people prior to the reconceptualization and the curriculum development era had a sense, accurate or not, that they were in touch with policymakers, that policymakers were listening to them and talking, and that they were influencing what was happening in schools? And kind of it's more since the reconceptualization that there's been this split.
Yeah. Those are both good questions. And I do think that that they, in a sense, they were in touch, but, so the major policy documents were made by the NEA up until about the 1960s. From the 1890s, the Committee of 10, Committee of 15, the Cardinal Principles, a lot of different things, all the booklets that came out during World War II and so on were all policy that was made by educators. And the leaders of education, including, presidents of major universities and as well as curriculum scholars, kind of work together on things. And there were curriculum people. I mean, Tyler, for instance, was a advisor to six presidents, six U.S. presidents. So I do think that that there is something to that. I think, though, also in the 60s, we experienced, with the civil rights and the anti-war movements and so on. I really felt like we could no longer say that we were doing democracy if we just listened to the voices of authority. We had to think about, we couldn't anymore be, and maybe we never should have been, people who just did the technical job of curriculum design for whatever we were told to do. And there was some of that still existed in the historical, the curriculum development era, So anyway, that's part of it. And I wish I wasn't, wish I could think more clearly about it. But I do think that as I mentioned at the dissertation that we were in yesterday, Dan, when the post-Sputnik response came up with the NDEA, I felt funny when I was given an opportunity to have an NDEA grant to study philosophy of education, because I thought, wow, why is defense supporting me, in this, I mean, and then here I was being chased by the, by the war in Vietnam, and, all of us at the time of my age group and so on were in dilemmas about what to do about being. This is before there was a lottery, before there was, it was just that, you get out of college and you get drafted and you wonder about, what you were being made to stand for. I mean, it was a huge dilemma. And I think, we really raised questions then about, can you just accept what policymakers, and who are these policymakers, tell you you're supposed to be doing, when you have thought so much about education and about curriculum, and now you're just supposed to facilitate what you're told to do. And I think that there was a lot of influence of that. It was, it's a massive intellectual influence too, but this was also, a huge influence on what happened in the field, I contend. And then post-Sputnik, when they did the NDEA, think about it, National Defense Education Act, all before that, education was supposed to be handled by states and local school boards and stuff. But this gave opportunity, permission, and so forth to people who were in policy-making positions to deal with education by saying, it's a defense problem.
Right.
And if you look at all of those movements that came, that the Elementary Secondary Education Act that spun off from that, and you look at the Nation at Risk, America 2000, No Child Left Behind, and Race to the Top, and all the other ones. It's like it's a defense problem, not just for war, but for economic defense.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime there's a problem, you can just call it an education problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to change education, you call it a defense problem.
Right. So now education gets wrapped up in
yeah. And so it makes it a lot harder, I think, to do anything in the institutions of education, the institution of schooling, a lot harder.
Mm-hmm.
That focuses on meaning or changing society, improving society to something better, improving ethical stance, and so on.
Right. That seems like as good as any note to sort of leave on, as depressing as it was.
That's depressing. Yeah, it's that's something that I'm working on now. I have this really hopeful book that I wrote in 2009, published in 2009. Mm-hmm. Called Love, Justice, and Education, mm-hmm. John Dewey and the Utopians. And they asked me to revise it. And I said, I don't want to revise it. I like what it says. But I said I'd be glad to continue it. So I guess that's what my so-called revision is going to be, is a continuation instead. But I have this thing that I played with when I was an elementary school teacher and writing in my spare time about these visitors from other parts of the universe who might be the utopians that Dewey met. I have this theory that I'm working on, in which I am arguing, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, that human evolution went awry when, not human evolution. Evolution went awry when when sentience stopped being inanimate and became animate. Because with the creation of life, what's happened is that we're in a so-called dog-eat-dog world. Mm. In order to survive, we have to eat each other. Mm-hmm. So conquest is the whole picture of life. And when we are too hopeful, so it's not going to be a hopeful continuance of the book. I'm kind of moving in that direction, but right. I got to figure out some kind of way to make it more palatable. I don't know. I'm really working on this, thinking about this all the time.
Maybe you can put the petroleum guy in the hope thing.
Yeah. He might be made out of petroleum. I think he is. He's a little rubber soldier.
Right.
He was the only. I chose him as the great athlete because he was the only one who wasn't carrying a gun. He was carrying pots and pans. He was the cook.
Oh,
Oh,
right.
well, there you go. There's your thesis right there. The
Yeah.
cook, the thief, and Mr. Petroleum Head. Whatever his name. Well, Bill, thanks so much. This has been very interesting and entertaining.
If you want to talk,
Didn't know you
more,
were
I'm
so
glad
funny.
to do it. If you want to have a part
Yeah.
two, but
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
I'd
have a
love to
part
have
two.
a part two. You know, to maybe go into some of those curriculum and development people, the sparks that ignited the reconceptualization. That would be really interesting because that's something that's looked over for sure. So, but we can set a date for that and figure
sounds
out.
good. Sounds good. Well, I really enjoyed talking with you, and
Yeah, well, thanks for doing
thanks,
this. Important.
thanks for your thoughtful listening
Yeah.
to and your responses. I
It was really
appreciate it a
fascinating
lot.
for sure.